Okay, welcome back, everyone. So we're running a bit late. Apologies for this. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speakers, Franz Knappik, University of Bergen, and Daniel James, University of Dresden and Düsseldorf. And they will present a paper together titled Theorizing Colonialism with and against Hegel. So we continue with Hegel. So let me introduce the two speakers to each in turn. Franz Knappik is professor of philosophy at the University of Bergen in Norway, and his research focuses on Kant's moral psychology, Hegel's views on race and colonialism, and Fichte's epistemology. But he has also written on different topics, including shelling. So I'd like to mention two of his papers. One is on Hegel's essentialism, natural kinds, and the metaphysics of explanation in Hegel's theory of the concept. So no race to be seen in this paper from 2016, published in the European Journal of Philosophy. And another paper from 2019, published in the Journal of the History of Philosophy, on Schelling's critique of Spinoza's necessitarianism in the Freedom Essay. Daniel James is lecturer at the Technische Universität Dresden, and he works on social and political philosophy and German classical philosophy. And they have Daniel and Franz have published together, but they're also organizing a workshop that's very relevant to this conference, a workshop series called Hegel Anti-Colonial. So I don't know when the next session is of this series, but it will be advertised widely, so I guess that many of those who are present now would like to also join these sessions of this series. Daniel has published among many other works and articles, a chapter in the Palgrave Handbook of German Idealism and Analytic Philosophy on Hegel and social metaphysics, social constructionism, objective concepts, and the case of occupational kinds. I'd have to read the article or to find out what this means. And then I'd like to finally mention two texts that Franz and Daniel have co-authored, both very relevant. So they published an article relevant to the conference in the Hegel Bulletin in 2022, titled Exploring the Metaphysics of Hegel's Racism, the Teleology of the Concept and the Taxonomy of Races. And then they have also written a small book called Hegel and Colonialism that will be published with Cambridge in the series Cambridge Elements, and that will probably be out later this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe next. Yes.
Well, somewhere soon. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Karen, and thanks for having us here at this. Here's a short summary of some ideas that we would like to propose in this talk. The first is that we propose that it's possible to distinguish two different conceptions of colonialism, or very broadly speaking, colonial phenomena in the Hegelian corpus. We call it an inner perspective and an outer perspective. Basically, the idea is that in his theory of civil society, including the paragraph 248, where he talks about colonization, he's looking at what he calls colonization there from a perspective that looks only at the relation between the mother country and the colonizers or the settlers. So issues regarding, for example, normative questions that have to do with the relation between the colonizers and indigenous people are not really topic there. We would think at least. And to get clear about Hegel's views about those normative issues when it comes to relations between the colonizing countries and indigenous groups of people, we have to look at other contexts. We talk about an outer perspective here, and the philosophy of history and the lectures, also the last part of the philosophy of right are relevant here. Also parts of the abstract, part of the abstract right, because it has to do with property rights, for example, slavery gets discussed here. And basically other contexts that we want to draw attention to in order to get a better understanding of Hegel's view about normative dimensions of. We also hope to at least suggest here, it will take more time than we have available to properly argue for that, but we want at least to hint at some interesting connections that we think there are between what we take to be Hegel's pro-colonial attitudes, something like a partial temporary justification of colonialism, and aspects of the system that are generally taken to be central, and there's also of contemporary interest for progressive causes. We therefore think that's something that we will point about at the end of the talk, that if you want to build on the progressive elements in Hegel's thought, we have to transform them. It's not simply enough to, for example, cut out Hegel's theory of race from the picture. We also have to transform those progressive elements because of that systematic integration. And we want to suggest, at least briefly at the end of the talk, that such a transformation has been attempted and perhaps also achieved in the Black radical tradition in various instances, and we use Angela Davis as an example here. First, very briefly about this inner perspective. Paragraph 248, also on the handout that you got, and we trust it also.
Yeah.
Discussion in the literature on Hegel's views about colonialism often focus on this paragraph and surrounding paragraphs. Here are some examples from the literature. However, we think that Hegel uses the term here in a way that is quite different from the way we normally talk today about colonialism. He looks specifically at processes of settlement here. That's quite explicit in the text, but he talks about this phenomenon where a part of its population, of the society's population, can return to the family principles of presumably agriculture in a new country and a new market. Those settlers then presumably can build form a new market for the mother country. And that's potentially a problem for structural conflicts in civil society. There are several issues that have been discussed around this paragraph. For example, how exactly does Hegel's view here relate to positions in the Scottish Enlightenment? There are various views about that in the literature. Also, what stance does Hegel take here on such processes of migration, basically, as a solution to structural problems in civil society? Some have read that as a just descriptive statement, others as an endorsement of this as a solution to the problems of civil society. Yet others have taken that to be a critique of a kind of proto-Marxian critique of civil society. There are also quite different statements in other texts by Hegel, so it could seem that he is perhaps wavering about the actual efficacy of this proposed solution. So, for example, in the late essay on the English Reform Bill, there's a passage where he seems to really reject a proposal in this direction. Immigration regulated by the state to the colonies as a solution for overpopulation he writes that this doesn't really seem feasible, and then the problem will just return. So he seems to be a bit torn about the feasibility and efficacy of that. However, we think that with regard to normative issues that have to do with colonialism, this dimension of his discussion of colonial phenomena is only of limited interest. For example, issues like colonial violence, they don't really get addressed here. As I mentioned earlier, we think that's simply beyond the scope of what he is looking at in the theory of civil society. And also, if one just takes the process that he describes here, we have a migration process that can be entirely peaceful. I mean, that just came up, and I find really the kind of comparisons that have been made were quite baffling, and I hope that we can continue to discuss this. But here, I would say what Hegel describes in this paragraph, he calls it colonization, but it's a process of migration that could be and can be entirely peaceful in instances like the British migration to the Americas, which he used as an example in lectures. That was a violent process, and Hegel knew that, but the connection here seems to be more contingent. So we therefore propose to shift the attention here more to this outer perspective. And there are some methodological or conceptual issues here, precisely because Hegel does not necessarily talk about colonizing or colonialism or colonies in that context. When he discusses phenomena, forms of conquest and rule that we would define as colonial. It's perhaps worth keeping in mind that the term colonies itself seems to be used in a somewhat different sense in Hegel's time than in our time, referring more to particular settlements for villages that are newly founded by settlers, for example. Not so much to entire spaces like North America as a British colony. And then in addition, we have this notion of colonialism today, and the adjective colonial to refer to all kinds of dimensions of a very complex historical set of phenomena and processes, including, for example, genocide, both cultural and biological genocide in connection with process of colonization, various forms of colonial rule, ideologies, for example, racist ideologies that have been developed in the context of those processes. So there's this much broader notion of colonialism today. However, one could argue that reading Hegel and also other authors in this time in connection with such an interest in the broader phenomenon of colonialism is not anachronistic, because that kind of discourse really was emerging in that time. And here, one important instance where this discourse is prefigured, at least, is Renal's and the later, which is also Diderot's huge encyclopedia about colonialism. Histoire philosophique politique des établissements du commerce des Européens dans les deux Indes. Or Histoire des deux Indes, more briefly, super interesting text, basically, which covers all the various colonial endeavors of the European countries, provides a lot of information, also normative assessments, criticism. So that's a text that Hegel was familiar with. He made excerpts from it in his period as a teacher in Bern. And they are the kind of problem space that we address today, or at least a lot of that problem space is already prefigured, you would say. And then it's also interesting to see, just in order to justify and motivate this kind of lens that we use in reading Hegel in connection with issues of colonialism, that there's just a big number of quite precise references in Hegel's own texts, lectures, but not only, also his published works, to quite concrete debates and also events, often recent events in colonial history. Here, just a couple of examples. And in quotes 3 to 7 on the handout, you get some passages where he's referring to, for example, particular debates in 1820 about abolition in the US Congress. Or also paragraph 248, the distinction between systematic and sporadic polarization. That is something that precisely in 1820 was discussed in the British Parliament, where there was a big political debate about whether immigration to colonies should be politically controlled and perhaps also supported. And actually, a so-called theory of systematic colonization, so exactly Hegel's term, was then officially adopted and was theoretically formulated just a few years later. So much just in terms of arguing that this kind of perspective is not anachronistic, and he was quite informed and apparently also interested in all these events and debates. So in order to reconstruct something like an implicit conception of colonialism from this outer perspective, where he addresses something like the relation between colonizers and indigenous people, we think it's useful to look at his discussions of some concrete forms of colonial regime, because there are several passages where he says relevant things that we will try to use some important examples to reconstruct that kind of conception of colonialism. And the first example is transatlantic slavery. He has quite a lot to say about that. It's a topic that he covers in his lectures, but he also addresses it in the remark on paragraph 57 in the Philosophy of Right, where he constructs a so-called antinomy of slavery, and one side the antinomy, so that's code 8. One side says that slavery is unjust, but the other side says that slavery is just and justified. And by constructing this as an antinomy, he quite explicitly tries to convince us that both sides are one-sided and we need something more dialectical. But that also implies that the view that slavery is simply unjust is not correct. So there's also some truth in the opposite claim. And he also explicitly rejects proposal for demands for immediate abolition. And why is there somehow also a kind of truth in slavery? One thing that he uses in order to argue in that direction is the Lord Bondage dialectic from phenomenology to spirit. He explicitly refers to this earlier part in phenomenology of spirit in the Philosophy of Right at this point, and then also in lectures. So there he makes explicitly this connection between transatlantic slavery and the Lord Bondsman dialectic, and uses, among other elements from that dialectic, this idea that the forced labor of the bondsman has a kind of educating function. So that's in quote 10 from Phenomenology of Spirit, this idea of a necessary role for service, and that this gives us a kind of discipline and allows to go beyond a stage of just arbitrary impulses, enables people to get control over themselves. And so these later texts, he uses that in order to argue that, yeah, slavery has this positive function, and it has also to be maintained for a while, at least still in existence, because that function hasn't yet been completely fulfilled. So there's this positive function that he apparently a positive normative assessment is partly slavery is something like a temporary, at least for a couple of centuries. Apparently, he thinks that there's a kind of need for transatlantic slavery. A further example are Jesuit missions in South America, especially in this region here in present-day Paraguay, I think. And here he describes in various lectures how indigenous Americans in these areas are treated like children by the missionaries. Here, so go further details. It also includes forced labor, and all details of everyday life are dictated by the missionaries as he describes it. And then again, here we have a kind of positive normative assessment, because it says that only these missionaries manage to treat the Americans in a way that is appropriate to them. It would be interesting to look at the contrast that there is also in his texts and his lectures between this kind of missionary colonial regime in these reducciones and the other parts of Latin America, where he seems more critical about the form of colonial societies that emerged. Unfortunately, that would lead a bit too far, but I just wanted to flag this here. There's also a difference that is between this form of regime and other parts of Latin America. And as a third example, British rule in India. And here he talks about a respect for local customs. So here he describes the British in the form of the East India Company as more or less respecting existing customs and cultural traditions and so on. He goes into quite a few details regarding the attempts of East India Company to study the details of Indian law and the traditional taxation system in order to build their own taxation on that model. And he again seems to express a kind of normative assessment of that form of regime in the Indian context, arguing that this form of regime supports ultimately assimilation, or is what works best in that context for the purpose of cultural assimilation, because in the end, Indians, as he claims, then start believing in superstitious things and so on, slowly well, thanks to this more respectful policy, as he describes it here. So if we take these three cases, quite different forms of colonial regime, and they are all evaluated positively by Hegel, at least he uses formulations that go in this direction. So it would be natural to ask, why should there be these differences? So wouldn't it then be okay, for example, to say that the British model in India can be applied globally in the colonies? Why should then enslavement be justified in that? Why should there be a need for a disciplining function of enslavement if it works so well without enslavement in India? And we think that a question to this answer can be provided by describing a conception of colonial rule to Hegel that we have tried to summarize here. Basically, the idea is that Hegel sees colonial regimes in the context of European colonialism as regimes of racialized domination. He assumes a hierarchical theory of race, which entails allegedly characteristic differences between racial groups, and these differences also have normative consequences with regard to what form of domination is, according to Hegel, appropriate or legitimate. So that then explains these differences. They are due to the normative differences. The different areas are due to each racial characteristics of those populations that Hegel thinks there are. And regarding the normative part, we think it's possible to we should distinguish two different dimensions that are relevant here. So one dimension of assessment concerns the question whether, from Hegel's view, the people in question fulfill the preconditions that there are on Hegel's account for things like property rights or sovereignty rights. And the other dimension of normative assessment is whether what he calls the absolute right of the idea applies, and that notion will be explained in a second. First, I will say something about the first point, are the preconditions fulfilled here. But before going to this, I just wanted to flag here as a further thing as a further question for discussion and research, what is exactly the relation on Hegel's view between these two conceptions, so this outer perspective and this inner perspective as in 248, organization as a migration process. Our present conjecture would be that these are ultimately conceptually independent conceptions with an extensional overlap, since in many forms they, in many cases, they have come together historically speaking. It's also interesting to discuss this in the context of work about the various approaches that try to distinguish between different forms of colonialism. For example, more recently in the approach called settler colonialism, which is distinguished from French colonialism. And so there are questions about whether all forms of colonialism involved migration processes, and perhaps they did, but the traditional view is more that there are these exploitation of franchise colonies where you just send some military people and some people to extract the resources, and all the work is done then by local people. And that's perhaps Hegel's view with regard to India and some part of the Americas. Anyway, it would just be interesting. Obviously, I think it's interesting talking to look more into these relations here. But that's just in parentheses. And now regarding this first dimension of normative assessment, are the preconditions for relevant rights fulfilled? These rights for Hegel always have to be institutionalized in order to have any kind of reality. And this institutionalization is always both social and individual psychological preconditions. When it comes to property rights, then one thing that we need in order to have property rights for Hegel is a system of mutual recognition as owners. And that is something that first has to come into existence in a society. We have to get an understanding of our roles as property owners and what we owe to each other, what that means that others have property. So that is not something simply given, that has to come about. And then he also makes a strong connection between the notion of property and what he calls personal will, also personhood. So both have to do with control, the ability to control both oneself and objects. And this ability for control, that has at least two important aspects. One is volitional and one is cognitive. The volitional aspect is an ability to say no, to distance oneself from all kinds of impulses and possible constraints. And if we don't have this ability, we are not able to exercise any kind of control. So we cannot even control objects and claim property over them. And this ability, he thinks, has to be acquired through education. So it's a matter of mental skills that have to be acquired. And the cognitive aspect has to do with a kind of self-understanding, where we have awareness of this ability for distancing. And as a form of self-understanding for Hegel, that also is the result of pretty complex processes of cognitive development and also historical development. So these are quite demanding preconditions that have to be in place, right, for there to be property rights at all. And with regard to sovereignty, if one looks at the question on the colonized people, don't they have sovereignty? Isn't that something that can be used to criticize the European colonization? He thinks that states have something like a demand, a legitimate demand for getting their sovereignty respected and recognized by other states, but that presupposes that these states have a particular amount of organization internal. He talks about content, constitution, condition. They have to have the right kind of complexity and elaboration and functionality. So-called 16 provides a bit more detail here. And if one then looks at the preconditions for these forms of organization that are necessary in order for groups of people to have legitimate claims to sovereignty, then one gets preconditions that are quite similar to those for property. So rule of law is necessary, and that introduces further constraints, because then the individuals have to develop the ability to understand a universal law and to be able to control themselves so that they can act according to the law and can be held responsible when they don't. Again, there's a connection to personhood here, this notion of a personal will, and then also a form of organization where a substantial will emerges in Hegel's terms, a general will, where there's a process of collective will formation, and that, at least on a Hegelian view, presumably requires that we are able to transcend our purely individual perspectives and have some kind of cognitive and volitional connection to a larger unity, which is then the whole of society and the state. So these are, again, relatively demanding cognitive abilities that are a precondition for there to be the possibility for a group of people to demanding or claiming sovereignty. And
so what's the plan for the remaining part? Because you're more or less running out of time.
Okay.
Because is Daniel also going to present?
Yeah, he's also going to present.
We can keep that topic going.
Let him go. I don't know.
Well, maybe you can wrap up your parts, Franz?
Yeah, I'm almost done with it. So then the point is, given these accounts of different preconditions, who qualifies it all for those rights that in theory could be used to resist colonialism or to criticize colonialism, to argue why it's unjust for Europe to colonize other parts of the world. And then here we think that, so we ascribe a hierarchical theory of race to Hegel. There's a lot more to be said about that. We will go into detail here. We have written about that elsewhere, which I think that if one looks at Hegel's claims about the racial characteristics of indigenous Africans and Americans and Asians, then one can see that for the case of Africans and Americans, he exactly denies the abilities that would be preconditions for property rights and sovereignty rights. So in 470, there are some more relevant foundations, but there are many others. And he also, in some passages, explicitly denies the existence of an understanding of personhood in Africa, or the existence of property in pre-colonial America, or the existence of full-blown states in Africa. So that then would lead to the following conclusion regarding this first dimension of assessment. Do the relevant groups fulfill the necessary preconditions? On Hegel's view, if they are or descend from Native Americans and Africans, no, they don't fulfill those preconditions, and hence there is nothing, normatively speaking, that they could oppose to attempts at colonization. They just do not qualify for property in land or also property over themselves when it comes to slavery or to political sovereignty. And within that context, Hegel then can use this idea from the master-slave dialectic that oppression has an educating function in order to argue that European colonization that will eventually, through regimes like slavery, enable them exactly to get those abilities and to fulfill those preconditions. And then ultimately they will be able to participate in a modern state with property rights and sovereignty rights. And that's all for my part. Sorry about taking so much time.
All right, I'll take over from here. In the interest of time, probably seeing now, I'll just wrap up the discussion of the absolute right of the idea. As Franz already said, the question we can have when one looks at these different assessments of colonial regimes that Hegel gives is, well, first of all, is there some organism principle was constructed? Assessment, we think, yes, there is. Namely, that what Hegel also calls the absolute right of the idea. I'll keep it very quick. Section 350 in the philosophy of right, Hegel says that it is the absolute right of the idea to make its appearance in legal determinations and objective institutions. And here, this is in the context of this theory of world history, which he conceives of as a development of conceptually the actualization of freedom that requires that certain, as he calls it, determinations and objective institutions exist. The important thing is that is the sole normative framework for this discussion of history. One can think of this as kind of a theodicy, so to speak. So whatever sort of occurs in history is justified to the extent that it contributes to the actualization of the absolute idea. And that means that this also, and this is something Hegel says following up, that this also entitles, as he puts it, civilized nations to regard and treat as barbarians other nations which are less advanced than they are as autonomous state. So here too the idea is, well, to the extent that such treatment would lead to the development of in Hegel's terms, to the appearance certain legal determinations, objective institutions, this too can be viewed as justified. And this practice, this approach can then sort of include, for instance, that the consciousness that the rights of those other nations, this is a quote, are not equal to theirs, and that their independence, the independence of these other nations, is merely formal. He then thinks of wars and conflicts in terms of struggles for recognition or reference to content. So here the idea is this more demand for the actualization of what he calls the absolute idea, basically realization of freedom in his sense of the term, trumps all other normative concerns. So when we now look at all these different colonial regimes, we can ask the question, well, what does the absolute right of the idea require here? And this is indeed, we think, sort of connected to the first phase too. Yeah? The absolute right of the idea does require private property, a certain level of organization in the state, and all these things. These things have to be brought about, and they are, in his view, brought about through colonialism. So now we can say that this absolute right of the idea applies in all of its cases, and the sort of the relevant agent here is modern Europe, being that it's been the most advanced in world history. If we now look at the American colonies, we can see that here colonization is in a way normatively overdetermined because we have neither for personal property nor sovereignty, but also in all the other things that might be required by the absolute right of the idea would also lack in Hegel's view. In the case of North Africa, so Algeria or Egypt, also in the case of India, here Hegel does not deny that there's property or statehood, but there's still a right to colonization because of more development, more organization can be brought about. It's not applied to other things. In the case of India, for instance, curiously, Hegel is fairly fond of the caste system because he believes this is sort of a kind of organization similar to the estates. So in this case too, colonialism has a civilizing function, but it is less invasive than in the other cases. So we could say maybe more an instance of modernization than of sort of this root disciplining that we find in the case, in particular of Africa. You can look at course 14, 15 for some textual evidence. One important point here is, at least that's how we interpret it, the absolute right of the idea only would provide a temporary legitimation, right? To the extent that this idea becomes realized, then colonialism would lose its legitimacy. But nonetheless, as long as we are on the way towards the realization of freedom, it is indeed legitimate. And I'll stop here just in the interest of time, although, of course, the discussion of how we could still proceed with and against Hegel is quite interesting. I just want to give you this one little image to consider in discussion, namely that all of these elements of Hegel's philosophy in this discussion of colonialism are very closely connected. So the question, of course, is if we want to somehow adopt elements of this, what else are we buying into, basically? And here you can see that here is temporary legitimacy and stable global rule, connection to is a kind of lordship and bondage. And then further up, conditions for property and sovereignty, his overall theory of freedom, but also how all of this is informed by his understanding of racial hierarchy, which in turn is connected to geography. And then, of course, all of this is framed by a particular view of history as development towards the idea of freedom that moves from the east to the west. And I'll stop here at this point. Hopefully, discuss other ones later.
Someone stop the screen sharing?
Yeah.
So we have some time for questions now, and so please raise your hand if you're online. The first question is from Elvira Basvich.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Apologies, my camera is not cooperating this morning. So my question is for Professor James, in particular, taking up this idea of how we ought to reckon with Hegel's concept of freedom as quote unquote absolute. And I suppose what I have in mind here is I would love to have more clarity about our metaphilosophical commitments, sort of the method that we're using in dealing with Hegel on race, and trying to sort of tease out or make more explicit what are your own, Daniel. So when we talk about, or it seems to me part of what is implied here in your conception of how to deal with Hegel on race is that we need to be very careful about what Hegel is actually saying and the geopolitical context in which this kind of rationale comes for his thinking on race. So my question is, how ought we then, as philosophers interested in this topic, take up the idea of freedom as being absolute, right? In the sense as holding a normative core that's truly about tapping into the potential for universal freedom. So it strikes me then that there are at least two branches that we could kind of tear apart here. The first one is that we could continue down this thread of saying that, look, we have a system here that Hegel has given us as part of his practical philosophy, in which the idea of freedom or the idea of right is historically delineated in all these ways that Hegel himself is both conscious and unconscious of. And we could continue to unpack that. Or we could raise this other kind of question, which is, what would it mean for us as a species or something like this to reckon with the past in a way that Hegel himself hasn't, to undertake a reconstructive project of sort of universal self-determination? And in that sense, neither Hegel nor history has the final say, so to speak, on what freedom can be. And one can push back, right? This is just sort of, a Charles Millsian reading about sort of Black radical Hegelianism, but I would like to invite you to say a little bit more, and in particular to locate the voices of Black radical thinkers in the 20th century who are exactly making this move, right? So trying to look to Hegel and look to Marx and sort of other resources that are tied to the history and the rationale, the mouthpieces for settler colonialism and white supremacist ideology. And yet, why assume that they have sort of the final say in how we ought to sort of really think about what freedom means? So it's a huge question.
Sorry, Afir, I'm sorry to interrupt this, but maybe can you maybe conclude so that
I'm done. Yes, sorry. I just wanted. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a really rich question. I'm not sure I can do it full justice, but I mean, in some way, I mean, you're right to identify that this sort of broader strategy that Franz and I have been pursuing. That's why we're very interested in looking at also the reception of Hegel in both the African American but also Afro-Caribbean traditions, because we think that very interesting things are happening there. And maybe just to start, maybe just try to remember this image of the puzzle, and we're thinking of Hegel's apology of colonialism as like the central piece here, and then the question is, okay, which other parts of his philosophical system support this, and which parts could we sort of leave out without threatening the overall integrity of the system as a whole. So one idea we've been playing with just as a guide how we think about this, we're thinking of, for instance, taking the absolute right of the idea, just like an algorithm, and we feed like different values into it, right? So on one side we put in Hegel's theory of race and the idea that there's a race-specific, well, both biological but especially spiritual traits. And then the idea is, oh, given these race-specific traits, what would the actualization of the idea of freedom require, and what would have to be important such that it could be actualized. So I already see sort of the different elements that clearly figure in this. And when we look into the Black intellectual tradition, we wanted to discuss the case of Angela Davis. You can see that she tries to take out certain elements of that theory while sort of leaving out others. I mean, of course, the hierarchical theory of race seems to be doing a lot of work in Hegel's account and sort of justifying different forms of regionalized systems of or regimes of domination. And like one element that she picks out is the idea of the idea that we can see freedom or of liberty as liberation, as something that is a process that typically requires struggle, as the model of lordship and bondage. But then also the idea that there's a nice video that we would like to show, actually, in which she addresses this idea that we can think of history of progress in the consciousness of freedom, but her understanding of what this expansion of consciousness is quite different than what we find in Hegel, namely that we sort of slowly expand this process to more and more oppressed groups who are sort of who are now become subjects of this process. And we think this is a very interesting way of transforming this idea, and one way in which people such as Angela Davis and others have back to the intellectual tradition, we think have moved with, against, and then at the end sort of beyond Hegel. So that's just a very quick answer, which you discussed in the occasions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, so we have a number of speakers on the list. So please try to keep your questions and answers short. So Stefan is next.
Yeah, thank you. A really interesting paper. So I appreciated the way that you, I think it was part, constructed an analogy between colonialism and property and sort of historical development. And I thought that was a great analogy, and I'm sure that's systematically founded in Hegel. So that makes me think of the question of colonialism in terms of the process of Bildung. And then I was led to think about the family, which is also about Bildung. But in the family, what happens is that the boy goes out into the world and the girl stays behind, and that's the end of it for the girl. And so then I thought, are the races supposed to be all? Are we only the white man, right? The white man, is the white man only in charge of other races until they've achieved freedom? Or, will they never achieve freedom because they're perpetual children?
We have to talk about it anyway, so we have to but I could point to some passages that are maybe wrong.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, the question is great, and I'm not sure whether Hegel has a definitive position on it. I think it depends on his views about the particular racial characteristics, and so it's not comfortable to just quote these things or to hit them, but regarding native people who descend from Africa, he claims that they have something like a remarkable capacity for getting educated by Europeans, and he in some places contrasts that with Native Americans, and so it might be that he thinks that the kind of process that he finds in Haiti, where on his view, as a result of assimilation to European culture, enslaved people were able to go through a revolution and build a republic, that may not be possible for Native Americans, at least according to some of the passages.
Yeah. Just a very quick, for instance, the whole privatization thing, right? You seem to think that only after mixing with European blood, they sort of acquire the traits necessary to then sort of become fully self-determined. So it seems to be, at least in some passages that you say, suggest that some people would otherwise, if they weren't sort of biologically mixed with other populations, remain perpetual children.
That's regarding the South American wars for independence. So it says that those new republics, they have been formed by people who were mixed with European blood, as I mentioned.
Okay. So, Manuel Tangola, it's your turn.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to Franz and Daniel for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I really like the image at the end of the puzzle in order to think how we work with the Hegelian elements and the problems to deal with it as isolated elements in a system. But I would like to take up the question of Stefan in a certain way to ask you what you think about this temporary condition of colonialism within Hegelian conception of history, because I think that we have more or less two main options to address this question. We can just say that colonialism is another contingency in history in a certain way, another contingent event with its particular institutions and ways of administration of human life that it has to be overcome in world history. But in the other hand, and regarding this absolute right of the idea, I don't know if maybe we can think of this temporary condition in a much more immanent understanding of temporality itself, because how this absolute right of the idea make itself real if not by producing temporary, provisional, or exceptional states that are constantly and I would say eternally produced in a certain way. I don't know how you address this problem between the provisional status of coloniality and the absolute and categorical right of the idea. Thank you again for your talk.
So I'm not fully sure I understand. So maybe we can discuss in more detail at another point later on. But just based on what we've argued, I think sort of how the whole question of provisionality hinges, I think, on how malleable one finds certain racial characteristics, and there is some evidence in Hegel's lectures that suggests that even if he thinks that so basically in a lot of traditional races, Hegel are biospiritual kinds. So we will find both biological, spiritual components, but there's sort of a loop between the two things. And this has to do with the fact that Hegel, like many thinkers in the 19th century, but also the 18th century, did not draw a clear nature nurture. And there's sort of even elements of anarchism in this view. Yeah. So you could think of the principle through processes of Bildung might slowly change their innate traits and these things. So one could imagine at least in principle, because it's very hard to say this is underdetermined by the textual evidence that through that kind of Bildung, and Hegel's view is brought about through of colonialism and enslavement, through Christian mission and these things, people could be educated to a point where they no longer possess these racial traits. So you basically breed them, but breed, he understood sort of this, in both sort of both in the spiritual and the biological sense, sort of breed these traits out of existence. I'm not quite sure. I feel like there's more in the question that I haven't fully understood. What I want to say is, I think our question of temporality or provisionality hinges, like we think, on his view of race and on how malleable he takes racial claims to be, because they clearly determine what kind of colonial regime would be adequate for. I hope that spoke at least to some extent to you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, it's now Cristobal Garibay-Peterson's turn.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to the speakers. So I suppose my question is relatively similar to the previous one, but now regarding not so much the provisionality, but actually the tenability of the absoluteness of the absolute right. In light of all of the seemingly contingent elements that Hegel brings into the account, is it really tenable to be speaking of something like an absolute idea here? I mean, I might be misunderstanding what absolute means, but it's just that, be it in the story about race, or as Kathleen Davis has shown, be it in the sort of dimension of periodization and the sort of attainment of sovereignty, it seems like precisely what one cannot uphold, even within the Hegelian system, is the supposed absoluteness of freedom, doesn't it?
So perhaps it's useful to distinguish two aspects here, if I understand your question correctly. One would be the absolute right itself that Hegel talks about, and which comes with particular with criteria for when that right applies. And as he writes, I think it's 351, these criteria are a difference in the substantial moments of state and society. And he mentions this example, also like agriculture, it talks about civilizational differences. So when that kind of difference obtains, then the more civilized and Hegel's society has this absolute right to disregard the claims and rights of others, and to use violence and so on. So that would be something that presumably, at least from Hegel's perspective, is dialectically justified and not simply a contingent matter of fact. It seems to be something like the we've talked about this morning. So the focal point perhaps of the theory of history, right? And so that would not seem to be a contingent element. What is contingent is the particular views about the characteristics of particular groups of people, and also the comparison between those groups. And on this, it will depend whether you will think that in a given case, those criteria are fulfilled. However, we also think that from Hegel's viewpoint, his hierarchical theory of race is not simply a bit of empirical theory that is simply inserted or attached to the system. We think that one can show that he tried at least to absorb this in a way into the system and provide something like a dialectical justification or explanation for a division of humankind into a certain number of races which come in a hierarchical order. But that's a point in addition. But perhaps at least this distinction between two levels would have helped
Yes, so Daniel, can you move the laptop a little bit so that you can be seen online? So
just to get thank you.
So Vicky, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks for a fascinating discussion. And also for making me see the Lord Bondsman dialectic in a completely different way by really highlighting that particular passage. But in terms of thinking about how we can still use Hegel, do you think that slavery is absolutely essential to that dialectic, or would, say, work be sufficient? I'm making it short.
I think this is a really good question. We're somewhat puzzled, I think, still about some of these things. It seems so if we just take the account as he uses it in section 57 of the philosophy of right, if we just use it there, it seems okay, some kind of discipline is required, right? And then you might think, well, this function might be multiply realized, and maybe there could be other ways of realizing that. But there's also this idea about having to submit in some way, right? There's what I forgot the famous passage where it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, something along those lines. That seems to be a crucial part of it, at least for Hegel himself. But yeah, it seems that there are potentially other ways of realizing, of sort of acquiring the same traits might be available. Again, constrained by what Hegel thinks about people's race-specific traits. I think that's just a point. Yeah, this is
okay, but since you're both here, it's very easy for you to continue the interesting conversation. So, final question by Gunther Zöller, and I'd like to ask you to keep it very, very short.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. My question is about the relation between colonialism and racism, and also about the subsequent development of these after Hegel, and what the Hegelian conceptuality and assessment, as you drew on it, would mean for that development. And it's a development, as I would see it, that is toward a totalitarian absorption of colonialism and of racism into developments of a more eliminative kind of procedure with regard to other population groups, other countries in the 19th century, and then especially in the 20th century. And what does the still very juridically cast approach to this phenomenon mean when it becomes a much more political and power political development in the 19th and especially then the 20th century? I'm thinking here about the way that Hannah Arendt, in her work on totalitarianism of the 20th century, uses the archaeology of these developments in the 19th century, the pathologies of the nation state, of the treatment of other groups, including a phenomena of racism, anti-Semitism, but also racism in the treatment of African peoples in the Congo, in German West Africa, and so on, in the 19th century. Do you think there is of significance to working with Hegel on these issues? Thank you.
I think I can at least formulate something like a question that would require, I think, further investigation and discussion, and that could has contributed, and that's really the role of genocide in Hegel. So there are these passages on the handout, and there are more where he talks about the colonization of the Americas. And I'm actually wondering whether one could reconstruct that part of his discussion as, in a way, yet a further colonial regime, although it's then a genocidal regime, where entire groups of people get annihilated. I mean, he also uses that kind of technology. Then he has often this. Well, he typically does not talk about Europeans killing indigenous Americans. He normally talks about them disappearing. It seems clear, and then there's some literature about his sources and so on. He clearly knew about the genocide of indigenous Americans. I would just like to understand better what his stance on this is, why he uses these formulations. They disappeared in the confrontation with a higher culture. Does that perhaps refer to the role that diseases played?
Infection.
Plays. But anyway, there seems to be at least some connection here to colonial genocide, and presumably that also can be assigned a place in a reconstruction of this implicit theory, and then that would make it, I think, directly relevant to those later developments and theories. At least something like a complete disregard for the. I mean, he doesn't seem to be disturbed about colonial genocide. While in other passages of philosophy of history, his discussions have also at the level of undertones very, very critical elements, and we would have had those resources in that case really as well. And perhaps it's possible to argue that he also sees some kind of normative, a lack of the preconditions. Perhaps it's possible to argue that from his view, the preconditions for people to be entitled for a right to life simply were not those cases. But that's to some extent speculative, but at least I think that there's more to be discussed there.
But maybe we stop here. So let's thank you.